This is 9/11 Freefall.
Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to 9/11 Freefall. This is your host, Andy Steele, and thank you for tuning in. My guest tonight for this special, or not so special, Halloween edition is Tony Szamboti. He's a mechanical engineer. He's one of the illustrious experts featured in 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, the documentary put out by AE 9/11 Truth. And he's going to be talking about his latest paper that's going to be hitting the internet pretty soon. And also, he's going to be giving an update on the situation with NIST leaving out the critical features in Building 7's design in its report. The critical features that, when you include them, completely makes NIST's explanation for what happened impossible. So we got some dry labbing going on from NIST, and this prompted the attorney William Pepper to send a letter to the Office of Inspector General about it. So we'll be talking about what's happened since then and what might be happening next. I'm going to play that interview for you in just a few minutes. Before I do play that interview for you tonight, though, I want you to listen to the following clip that I found when I was scouring the internet. And this is from a TV network that existed in the 90s. I'm not sure if this TV network exists now. I don't think too many people actually got this network. This was a network that was targeted towards lawyers. It was all, they were basically the audience, was attorneys. And it talked about different issues that come up in their profession and different things that happen during the trial process. And in this particular program, it featured three people. It had a host, who I assume had some kind of legal background, and it had an attorney and a judge sitting there with them. And in this episode, they're talking about the use of computer models in trials. But I want you guys to listen to this part here. And as you're listening, I want you to ask yourself, what does this have to do with 9/11 Truth? How does this relate to 9/11 Science Truth and a particular part of 9/11 Science Truth that we talk about a lot on this program? So go ahead and listen.
Illustrative evidence.
Suppose, if I can stay with you for a second, suppose you're the lawyer who has decided that you want to use a tape like the one we've seen, and I'm the opposing counsel. And suppose I say, when you tell me you want to use this kind of tape, I want in discovery. I want to get the software that you've used to generate it. I want to get the data that you used to input to generate this tape. And I want to basically see if I can replicate, and if I can, by changing some of the assumptions, generate different images. Do you fight me in discovery about disclosure?
The truth of the matter is if I really want to get this in, I don't think it's wise to be fighting that kind of disclosure, because you've made it more difficult for the other side to probe the truth and given them an argument to present to Judge Smith or the presiding judicial officer as to why it ought not come in. The principal argument that you hear is an argument that whatever software was begun with, it has been made proprietary by the addition of theories of the entity that's created the tape. I find that unpersuasive under Rule 26, not only because of the expert report rule, but because in Rule 26A, the last segment of that rule says that all other discovery still remains available regardless of mandatory disclosure. So I do believe that that is something which is required. I think that's why the Manual for Complex Litigation has said so for more than a decade. It's why the Civil Trial Practice Standards of the ABA would call for it in the same setting.
Judge Smith, suppose we had a lawyer who was less reasonable than Greg Joseph and asserted that this was proprietary, that it was a secret, that it was something that the expert had generated and the expert didn't want to disclose the details. Would you require the disclosure?
Absolutely. I think proprietary claims end when you list someone as an expert. If you want it to remain a secret, then keep that person as a consultant. But one of the big concerns among trial judges these days on computer-generated evidence is fairness. And what you often find are cases in which one side is far more able to spend the kind of money that some of these things take. Now, Now, I don't think it's fair to say that the side with more money needs to pay for the other side to go out and do the same thing. But it seems to me a valid compromise and a way to balance things out is to say, fine, if you want to do this, that's okay, but you've at least got to make these underlying bits of information available just the way you would an expert's notes in a less sophisticated issue. It's all the same thing as far as I'm concerned.
So there you go, folks. You have an attorney and a judge talking about computer models being admitted in trial, and they're saying that in trials, the side that wants to use the computer models to submit that as evidence would need to disclose its input data to the other side so that other side can review that data and see a number of things, mainly if the information they're putting into the models is correct and if they change some kind of factors or observe the event and see that something is different, see if you would get the same result. Now, anybody that follows 9/11 Science Truth and this program probably knows why I played this, because we have the issue with NIST refusing to release its input data on its computer models that it uses to try to justify its phony explanation of what happened to Building 7 on September 11th. Okay, despite Freedom of Information Act requests, they refuse to give that information out. Now, there's some differences, obviously. First, most striking difference is there's not a trial going on right now, other than the trial of public opinion, which I also think is important, too, because the public needs to be assured that its government is working in its best interest and that the investigation into 9/11 was complete, which obviously it wasn't. So there's no trial going on. Also, too, NIST is not refusing to release that information based off of some proprietary concern, but because they say that doing so would jeopardize public safety, as if releasing this data on a building that no longer exists would somehow harm the public. Both you and I know that's ridiculous. But it's interesting to hear this discussion and to put it through the prism of a hypothetical trial. And I don't want to speak in absolutes because I don't know everything about the law. I'm not a lawyer myself. I don't know what tricks lawyers would use to try to get around this. But in this discussion, in this program that was taped long before 9/11, you have a judge and an attorney saying about computer models as evidence that the input data needs to be released. And again, without being a lawyer, I would like to, just as an optimist, imagine that perhaps, just perhaps, this might be a preview of what a judge would say in a trial that could happen in the future over this issue. All right, it certainly would need to be discussed, but it's interesting nonetheless. So I wanted you all to hear it too. All right, before I play my interview with Tony Szamboti, we're going to do what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We're going to do that starting now. And that is 10 seconds. Tony Szamboti is a mechanical design engineer with 27 years of experience in the aerospace and communications industries. He's a member of AE 9/11 Truth. He was involved in the Remember Building 7 campaign, and he was on national TV with Bob McIlvaine back in 2010 to talk about the controlled demolition evidence. We all remember that. He also appears in AE 9/11 Truth's documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out. He's been a guest on this show in the past, and he's back today to talk about his new paper. Tony, welcome back to 9/11 Freefall.
Hey, thanks for having me, Andy.
Tell our audience, what have you been up to since the last time we talked about a year ago?
Well, I was involved with, the Ask NIST about the emissions. That's what we were talking about then. And Dr. William Pepper wrote a letter for AE 9/11 Truth bringing up those emissions with NIST. And actually, the letter was written to the Department of Commerce Inspector General, who's over this is a part of the Department of Commerce, and the Inspector General forwarded that to NIST, and this was in December of last year, and then eventually, I think the last time I talked to you was last summer, in the August time frame, somewhere around there. But anyway, he sent them a letter that detailed these omissions and showed that they had been included in NIST analyses. Their collapse initiation hypothesis would have been impossible. And these are, of course, the stiffeners on the girder they claim fell off its seat at column 79 that precipitated that whole failure that they allege. And there's also lateral beam supports for the exterior columns at the furthest, the beam in the northeast corner closest to the exterior. They left them out in another analysis and said that that beam would have buckled, where if it had those lateral support beams, I should say, what they're actually called, that beam could not have buckled because it would have decreased the slenderness tremendously. And the buckling of a beam or a column is a function of the slenderness squared. So, when you decrease it by half, you make it 4 times less likely to buckle. And in this case, it would have been decreased by, there was 3 support beams, so that would have been 4 times. So it would have been 16 times less likely to buckle than it was without those lateral support beams on it, which they left off. And they left them off for the same reason they left off the stiffeners on the girder, because they would have made their analysis impossible. So they answered, finally in April, they answered Dr. Pepper that they didn't agree with his assertions, the assertions that were contained in his letter, and that they didn't feel the need to amend their report, and that they stand behind their work. They did not justify their position whatsoever, and it was basically a stonewall. It was, you can't do anything to us, we're not going to do anything. That type of thing. So it wasn't in good faith at all, in my opinion.
Well, I love how government can do that, where they can just close their doors to the American people who have very legitimate questions, and they don't feel like they need to even explain it. I mean, here you are, you're a qualified engineer, you're raising these points. Now, you guys were talking about a potential lawsuit if NIST handled things the way that, basically the way that you just described it. How is the thinking on that going?
Well, there are lawyers looking into that. I don't know exactly all the details. Apparently it's not that simple to just sue, but I believe there has to be a remedy. You can't just be lied to and, be stonewalled by, an agency like NIST could be infiltrated by criminal elements. And if somebody just says, no, we're NIST, we're not going to do anything, I believe there has to be a remedy for that. If you show that what you're saying is legitimate and that they're not answering. So I don't know what the lawyers are trying to discern right now, but this is wrong. Their collapse initiation hypothesis for Building 7 is absolutely impossible if the real structure was used in their analysis. It couldn't happen.
Well, as an American and as a human being, you like to think that there is a remedy, that they can't just close the door in your face and get away with the crime of the century. You like to think that there's some kind of recourse, but with this issue, it's proven tough. And I'm not being a pessimist. I absolutely believe we will overcome it. But this is such a monumental feat that we're trying to undertake just in the terms of resistance, not just from the government officials who were tasked with investigating this tremendous crime, but from a society that a large portion of it still is afraid of facing this issue. They've built their sandcastle on the official line. They do not want a tidal wave to come by and knock it over. And of course that would. It would be good for America, but bad for some individuals who have profited off of this event and the official lie surrounding this event. So I want to ask you... Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to point out, I'll let you ask your question first because I was going to go off on a tangent a little bit.
That's all right. I like tangents.
Well, I was going to give a corollary or in the Kennedy assassination, there was the Warren Commission, and then there was a couple smaller entities like the Clark panel, where they reviewed the autopsy in the late 60s. There was the Rockefeller Commission, which looked at certain things in the early 70s. And then finally, after that Zapruder film was shown on Geraldo, in March of 75, there was an outrage for the public when that film had been suppressed. And the reason it was suppressed is because JFK's head went back into the left, which is indicative of a shot from the front. So that caused the second large investigation, which was the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And ultimately, they did have to admit, because of acoustic evidence that came up, where a cop had his mic open on a motorcycle and it recorded the shots, and there was more than 3. And the timing of the event made it impossible for one man or one person to fire more than 3 shots. So they had to open up, they had to admit that there was a conspiracy. They just said they didn't know what it was. And then it was remanded to the Justice Department, and the Reagan administration came in 1981 and then sort of jerked around with it, sent things to the National Academy of Sciences, didn't look at it in an appropriate way. And we had the Oliver Stone movie. I would assume something like that's going to happen with 9/11 sooner or later, and that caused people to get in a rail again. When it was at the end of the movie, he had a prologue that said there's still a lot of classified documents, and Congress passed the JFK Records Act. And George Bush Sr. wanted to veto it, but Clinton and Gore were running against him, and Gore said, I don't think Oswald could have done it, and Clinton said, no, I don't either, and that put George Bush Sr. on the spot. He passed it, and the Assassination Records Review Board was created that ran from 1994 to 1998. It wasn't supposed to be another investigation. It was only supposed to be a document review agency to ensure the American people nothing was being hidden. But there was some naval officer by the name of Douglas Horn, a former naval officer who was working as a civilian at the time in Hawaii in the Navy's anti-submarine warfare program, applied for a job with it. And he had read different books over the years. I guess he was somewhere in his mid-40s at the time. And he actually took a pay cut to get on it. And he found, while he was on there, that there was 2 brain examinations, and the second one could not have been JFK's. And in addition to that, he spent 10 years after that writing a book called Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. I'd recommend people reading it. It's 5 volumes, but you read any one of them. This man is completely objective, and he says, he shows the evidence of alteration with the Zapruder film and the medical evidence. The president's wounds were altered at Bethesda Naval Hospital before the autopsy. There was a shell game with caskets. At any rate, I'm just saying that the truth did come out on that eventually, and somewhat officially. However, it's radioactive to the government, and they're not going to open up a new investigation. So just like Obama said with 9/11, he wants to look forward.
Well, it came out to a disinterested public for a large part of it. I mean, I was 12 or so. I don't remember the exact age, but I was a kid when that came out, and I came away thinking there probably was a conspiracy. But, it happened a long time ago in my little kid view, and I didn't really think about it until 9/11 happened. And I fear the same thing happening with 9/11, that it may be admitted someday that Building 7 was a controlled demolition, and perhaps a nurse at the retirement home that I'm at will come in and say, Mr. Steele, they admitted to this, and I'll look up and dodder my head a few times and be like, oh, and have them change my colostomy bag. I don't know, but I don't want that to happen with 9/11. That's why it's so important.
Yeah, I agree. They're wrong. The NIST report is wrong. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The problem is you're fighting a Goliath, and you're going to have to find a way to make the slingshot work right. So, Goliath, the way David was able to defeat Goliath, what I've read is that some Goliath didn't have good peripheral vision, and that's how he was able to approach him with the slingshot to get within range. So, it's not that easy to fight something like this. They're obviously wrong. There's no question that the World Trade Center 7 could not have come down the way NIST says so. In fact, the only way it could have come down that way is to take out the core columns, 8 stories of core columns, and that would bring that building down in free fall symmetrically.
And the David analogy he used, he had to be clever, and that's what we're doing too. And we're getting better and better at reaching out. And I mean, part of it, and part of the reason that I support AE so much, is because the science is going to be what proves it. People can write off other things, can try to write off what arguments about what was potentially going on in this particular politician's head, but they can't really dismiss the science other than doing these crazy stonewalling things like you described with NIST. And you've got this new paper out. This is going right along the lines of what we need, what I want to see in writing to present to scholarly people, professors, other engineers in the private practice. 25 points. I'm going to let you describe it here, but the title of it, let me just get it in front of me again.
Well, I can say that. We call it Areas of Specific Concern in the NIST World Trade Center Reports. And the 25 points are about World Trade Center 7 and the Twin Towers, things specific to them and things in general pertaining to all 3 buildings. And each point has a technical statement that describes the issue. Well, I should say a title, a technical statement describing the issue and why there's a problem with the NIST report, and then references backing up that technical statement.
Now, you've got a lot of papers out. Why did you feel the need to write this new paper?
Well, this paper, it's not actually just me. This was an outgrowth of, I guess it was 2009 or 10, whenever there was 1,000th architect or engineer signature on the petition for 8911 Truth, and Richard Gage held a press conference, I think it was in San Francisco, in February of, might have been 2010. And he rattled off a series of 5 to 7 points that are some of them are included here, on what he thought was grist for the mill for a grand jury. So I emailed him that there was a number of things that were provable, and he asked me to write them up. And it came out to be 24 points at the time, and I just gave it to 8911 Truth, and it sort of languished. Nobody was doing that much with it, and David Cole picked it up again because he was dealing with some people that might be interested in using it somehow. I helped him with that this summer. We resurrected it and completed it, and he sent it to Richard Gage, and he wanted to add some things with in the references, pertinent clips from the Experts Speak Out video, and we added them. And anyway, we finally got it out, and so really, the intent was as grist for the mill for a grand jury, for them to contemplate and consider, because there's problems with these reports, and that's what it describes. There's 25 provable points shown here. They're the most glaring issues with the report, and they're provable reports, I should say. World Trade Center 7 report and the report on the Twin Towers. And some of them, if you look at them, they didn't save the steel, and it shows that NIST was involved. John Gross was there in the yards right away, and yet they didn't save any steel from Building 7, and only 0.25% to 0.5% from the towers. And then when they couldn't find temperatures in excess of 250 degrees centigrade where steel hasn't lost any strength, they only found it in 3 spots, or 3 pieces out of the 236 they got, which is a very small percentage of what was in the towers. They only found temperatures in excess of 250 degrees centigrade, like I said, where steel hasn't lost any strength yet, on 3 pieces. And even then, it didn't exceed 600 degrees C, where steel has only lost 50% of its strength. So they couldn't find temperatures to support evidence of temperatures, because steel will change its, you'd have mud cracking. They did a couple tests. They did a mud cracking test, and the temperature has to be above 250 degrees centigrade to get that to happen. That's what happens to the paint on the column or beam, the structural member. And that didn't happen in most cases, and a couple of cases that it did, or 3 little cases that it did, that they used another test because the spheritization will change. It's a permanent change in the structure, and nothing got above 600 degrees centigrade. So they didn't have the temperatures on the steel to back their theory. It looks like that steel didn't get that hot, and this is why no steel frame high-rise building in history has ever collapsed due to fire, because the amount of heat load, the heat load to get those large pieces of steel up to temperature is hard to get in an office fire. There's just not the fuel load in office furnishings and carpet and draperies. It burns up before you don't have enough energy to get that steel hot enough to cause it to weaken.
Now, there's a section in the report where because you mentioned John Gross just a minute ago, where John Gross is standing in his hard hat and blue jeans by some metal. And I don't know if our audience has heard about why this picture is so significant yet. So can you please explain the context and why this picture was included? Yeah, because FEMA, in their initial study on the World Trade Center and Building 7 collapses, a professor from Worcester Polytechnical Institute, Jonathan Barnett, found the piece from Building 7, and that's the piece that John Gross is holding. And it had holes in it, which means the steel was melted, and office fires can't get hot enough to melt steel. Office fires provably can't get hotter than 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, and steel doesn't melt until 2750, or even begin to melt until 2750 to 2800. So there's 1,000 degrees difference, and he found melted beams. And the one that John Gross is holding has holes in it. It was melted. So that means there was something there besides office fires that caused that melting. And when FEMA looked at it, when the Worcester Polytechnical professor, Jonathan Barnett, looked into it more deeply, him and I guess another person or two, they found that there was intergranular melting and that the steel was sulfidated, meaning sulfur was embedded in it. And that can't happen with sulfur in like drywall. That sulfur is in, it doesn't come out as sulfur. The only way that can happen is some kind of incendiary had to have sulfur in it, and there is an incendiary that does. It's called thermate. And what it is it causes the steel to melt at a lower temperature. Having sulfur in thermite, which is aluminum and iron oxide, when sulfur is introduced to that, it causes a eutectic reaction. And what that is, a eutectic reaction is where the alloy melts at its lowest temperature. For instance, tin lead solder is a 63% tin. I think it's 63% tin, 37% lead alloy, and that combination, those percentages, cause it to melt at 367 degrees Fahrenheit. When you move away from those percentages, the melting temperature goes up. So what the addition of sulfur in thermite does is cause the steel to melt at a lower temperature. It causes a eutectic reaction. That's what they said. They explained that there was a eutectic reaction causing the steel to melt at a lower temperature. And that's the beam, or one of them, that John Gross is holding or has his hand on. And they were claiming that there wasn't enough steel saved, when they couldn't find enough temperatures. Well, he was in the yards. Why didn't they save enough steel? Especially when they saw this kind of thing melting. And I want to explain the significance of to the audience here, because mixed in with all of this technical talk and numbers here, if you go and watch Blueprint for Truth again, there's a segment in it where John Gross is asked by an activist while he's speaking at some event about melted steel. And John Gross says, well, I never saw any evidence of that. He says it very arrogantly and with certainty there, and then they lay out, or AE 9/11 Truth has a string of videos of various first responders and politicians who showed up to grandstand on the rubble talking about the melted steel. So now we have a picture of John Gross standing there with steel that has holes in it, all right, and is showing signs that it melted. So we have a problem here. He's either extremely incompetent, which I find hard to believe, or he's covering up. He's lying. So I just want to point that out to the audience.
Right. That's a very good point. And, yeah, that's another part of this whole thing, that he's saying that, I think that's in the this clip that we reference here. It has him saying that he's never heard anybody, he's never talked to anybody that saw it. He saw evidence of melted steel himself, and there's a picture of it right there. So yeah, he's arrogantly denying it in that clip. I think that was at the University of Texas or something like that, where somebody asked him about it, and he denied it.
I mean, this should be a national scandal, folks. And just because we're talking about all the scientific stuff, it's not as exciting sounding as maybe a Bill Clinton sex scandal or something like that. This is huge, okay? This is a member of NIST openly lying about evidence that shows that this was a controlled demolition. This should be on the front of the New York Times. We all know why it's not, but it should be in a world that is more perfect, or in an America that doesn't exist anymore. All right, so this is why you need to be spreading this broadcast and telling people about Tony's report here and about all of the evidence that AE 9/11 Truth lays out, but particularly this thing right here, and writing to NIST about it too.
Yeah, let's not forget that there's 3,000 people killed, or close to that, 2,974 or so, I think, on 9/11, and the vast majority, 90% of those were in the buildings in the Twin Towers in New York City. There's been people that have died after that due to the dust, and don't forget the two wars, and who knows how many people have actually been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan unnecessarily that were innocent because of this. So it's a very big deal. It's a much bigger deal than a sex scandal, with the president and a young intern. It can happen to anybody. People have to remember it could happen to you. It could happen to one of your relatives, and could just be covered up because that's the convenient way to go, and somebody wanted what they wanted.
Now, I want to make sure that we cover this during the interview. I found very interesting at the end you have a diagram of the patented structural steel cutter charge. Now, can you describe this charge? And I want to know who created this thing, who owns the patent on this charge, and then I'll have a follow-up question after that.
Yeah, that one was from Richard Gage, actually. That's one of Richard's. So I'm going to have to beg off on it a little bit. I can discuss it to some degree with you. It's a device that focuses the thermite or thermate on the column. That's basically what these devices do. They do the same thing with explosives. Linear cutter charges, the way they work, they funnel the explosive. You'll see a triangular. In those cases, it's an inverted V type thing, and it focuses the energy to the cut. And this does the same thing. Only instead of expanding gas, this uses a very extremely hot metal in the form of thermite or thermate or nanothermite or nanothermate. So that's what this device does, and it's used for the same purpose. It can cut steel.
Now, what I'm curious about is what would be the purpose of creating a structural steel cutter charge using thermite? Now, I understand someone will say, no, duh, it's to cut the beam. But, I mean, is there actually a practical use for it in controlled demolition, or would the use be strictly clandestine in order to bring down a building secretly? I mean, is there any practical advantage of using this kind of cutter charge for controlled demolition companies?
I don't know that there is for controlled demolition companies. There may be if they can only have so much sound. If they have to keep the sound down, it will keep the sound down. You're not going to have the same detonation velocity, and you don't need it as much because you have the heat. So nanothermite doesn't have the detonation velocity of like RDX or C4, for example. So it's not going to make nearly as much noise. But it has extreme heat. So, you're using two things, heat and some level of fairly high, a high speed. It's not low. It's somewhere around 3,800 feet per second versus RDX would be about 27,000 feet per second. So this isn't going to make nearly as much noise, and demolition companies might use it if they have to keep the sound down. I don't know. But it would also possibly be used for covert purposes, I would think, if you don't want people to know that's what you're doing.
Well, and it's funny because what kind of covert purposes would you use it for other than bringing down a building secretly? And if our government is so transparent and it doesn't do things like secret assassinations anymore, I don't know why they would need to have something like that. If they're bombing a building, then you would bomb a building and openly announce it to the American public that this is what you're doing because of this or that threat. But to bring it down quietly, to bring down a building without any noise, I don't see why our government would need to utilize such a technology, or why controlled demolition companies, unless they want to bring the sound down, and that might be a practical reason, that maybe they don't want to create a disturbance, although you're going to create somewhat of a disturbance in any area that you're bringing down a tall building. Obviously, that's gonna cause some snafus in the community until all of that's cleaned up. So I don't know, but that's a question that you should be pursuing out there in the public as well, and asking of controlled demolition companies.
Yeah, well, I could see a use for it possibly militarily. I don't know, if you don't want somebody to know that you took something out, a mile or two away, something like that, it's possible.
Now, we have in there also point 18, and I don't know if we've ever discussed this on the show. I found this interesting because of the word, the term, that it was induced artificially, the inward bowing. I'm not sure, like I said, if you've discussed it before in the show, but can you mention it here about the artificial inward bowing?
Yeah, sure. Let's take the North Tower, for instance. NIST said that the south wall was bowed in, that the trusses were heated to 700 degrees centigrade. The fireproofing had been knocked off by the aircraft impact. This is on the other side of the building, mind you. The plane hit on the north, so it's hard to imagine it happening. But they're saying the fireproofing was knocked off. The trusses were heated to 700 degrees centigrade. They sagged, and they pulled the exterior wall inward, causing it to fail, buckle and fail. When you bow columns in, they get eccentric. You have eccentric loading, and they can buckle. Well, they said that's what happened, but then when they actually tried to do that in their analysis, they caused the trusses to sag, but that didn't cause the wall to bow inward. So they say there's pictures of this, so they added artificial 5,000 to 6,000 pound loads to those columns, like a load that's going horizontal. Because the trusses in their analysis, their finite element analysis, didn't cause these exterior columns to bow inward. It didn't put enough force on them. So they put the force on there artificially to get them to bow inward.
Yeah, and it just baffles me how they're able to get away with this stuff. I mean, essentially, if I want to boil it down to layman's terms, it seems like they just created a cartoon of what they would like to have happened, how they would like to explain it happening, and then they offered it to the American public, but they wouldn't release the data that went into it. It's going to create some kind of public safety issue, apparently, according to our government, if they do that. And as Richard Gage often points out, it actually jeopardizes public safety not releasing it, because as architects and engineers, people in these professions are tasked with knowing more about their science and not making buildings that fall down. So they need this data. It's a completely irrational argument made by NIST in not releasing that. But essentially, they made this cartoon with all of these problems and then just closed the books. just left it up to their word on things and want no more debate, no more study on this huge event that still affects us to this day. I'm just baffled by the fact that they're able to get away with this. I'm not naive on the nature of things in America, but as a scientist, because as an engineer you are a scientist too. Just personally, where does this leave you? Because I know you guys in your profession are used to working with hard facts, hard numbers, and adjusting realities as the data changes. Just personally, how does this jive with you and your way of thinking, and how do you deal with this reality?
Well, it's baffling, and it makes you realize they're just lying. Okay, they are just lying. The engineers have to deal with reality because things have to work. NIST could not make this work. Like I said, it's a circular argument they use. That the trusses, the sagging trusses, could not cause those exterior columns to bow inward, so they put an artificial load on it that's like fudging or cheating, and they give a circular argument that there was a picture that showed the columns bowed inward. Well, in engineering, you would never be able to get away with this in industry, where you had a picture showing something and you couldn't cause a real mechanism where you used an artificial load to, something that couldn't happen in reality to cause it in an analysis. You'd have to show what happened in reality. You'd have to replicate it with real structural members or real items. They didn't do that. Okay, so they never replicated the failure. And they're just saying, well, we're just doing what we had to do artificially to replicate the evidence. Well, was there really evidence of that south wall being bowed inward? I can tell you right now, there's no video of it. It's an interesting thing. They claim it was bowed inward 22 minutes before the collapse. I think it only bowed inward once the core was taken out, because that's how these buildings were taken down. Their cores were removed over so many stories. And if you notice, when you watched closely, there was some earlier, 5 years ago or so, there was more of it. I don't see much on the internet anymore. Of the initial collapses you saw in the towers, you saw the exterior columns being pulled inward. Okay, and that would happen when you remove the core, because they would pull the exterior columns through the floors. But in that case, the load is the falling core, not just a sagging truss. It's going to put a lot of load on it, and the floor connections could take that, and they would pull those columns inward. But that wouldn't happen until the building started to collapse, not 22 minutes before, and not because of sagging floor trusses. So they didn't want to talk about the collapsing core pulling it in when it collapsed. They're trying to say that wall was bowed inward way before, and then that was the actual cause of the collapse. But they can't make it happen in their analysis. They can't replicate it with anything real. So they don't have something that anybody in the industry would go along with. Have
they provided that evidence? I mean, they say that they saw this happening many minutes before the collapse, this inward bowing. Have they provided that picture or video that they saw?
They have a picture that they claim was taken 22 minutes before. They claim that, but it's only a picture. And you can claim a picture was taken at a certain time. There's no timestamp that I know of that absolutely provides proof that was 22 minutes before. I don't know of any pictures that have a stamp or that can actually be shown that would provide real evidence of inward bowing many minutes before the actual collapse occurred. I think the inward bowing occurred when the collapse initiated. That's what I believe.
Right. I mean, you see these buildings, with the exception of the holes in them and the black smoke coming out, these buildings look pretty solid up until the building comes down. That's right. And we don't see, in the case of the North Tower, they're looking at the north face all the time because that's where the aircraft impacted. They're saying that the south wall bowed inward. There's another problem with it, too, because they do, and in the NIST report, whoever did the aircraft impact analysis did do a pretty good job, and they were honest. And they show, this is very interesting, and I think it's in one of these points also. They show that it's actually point 15. The stripping of the fireproofing is exaggerated.
NIST own tests proved that the fireproofing could not have been stripped off because their aircraft impact analysis has the aircraft impacting and the velocity, it gives the velocity over time. It's degrading as it moves into the building, the velocity of the debris. And at 0.4 of a second in, the debris is down to 51 feet per second, okay, or 15 meters per second. NIST did a test on the sprayed-on fire-resistant material. It was sprayed on plates and bars, and they put it in a big plywood box, and then they fired shotgun blast at it with all kind of debris and the nuts, bolts, and things like that in the shotgun. And they were firing at 500 feet per second, and it removed the SFRM, the fireproofing material. But at one point it misfired and produced a projectile velocity of just 102 feet per second, and it didn't damage the SFRM. So in their impact analysis with the aircraft, by the time the debris field gets through the north side and through the entire core to the south side, where they say these trusses had their fireproofing removed, were vulnerable, heated up and sagged, and pulled the wall in. By the time it gets over there, the speed is only at 51 feet per second. It's half of what their failed misfire velocity was that didn't damage the SFRM. So there's really no chance that the fireproofing was removed on the complete opposite side of the building by that aircraft impact. There's no chance. In addition to that, there's another thing that disproves it. The aircraft hit the building between the 95th and 96th floors, nose down at 10.6 degrees, 10 degrees essentially. That's on the north side. They're saying the fireproofing was stripped off under the 98th floor on the south side. Now that aircraft, by the time anything gets over to the south side, that debris would be mostly down, certainly below the 96th floor and below. It wouldn't be anywhere near the 97th and 98th floor. So it's sort of, the whole thing is just, if you don't look into it close enough, you might not see it. It's smoke and mirrors.
Well, it's interesting that they seem to have documented the misfire and that the misfire happened, allowing you to understand this conclusion that you just described. It makes me almost sometimes wonder, this is beyond the realm of science, but if there's some higher force helping us out with little things like that happening. But it's a good thing that it did happen because, like I said, it helps you reach that conclusion. And you mentioned also, go ahead.
And, everybody doesn't have to be in on it. Whoever did this test may not have been in on it. They reported the results. They just reported what actually happened.
Well, yeah, that's why I love these happy little mistakes during the investigation or during the event that gives us an opportunity to actually analyze the truth of what happened that day, and it's almost like a little key turning in a lock.
Right. There's similar things in the Kennedy assassination too. And I don't want to belabor that, but I'm just going to say that, Lee Harvey Oswald was blamed for killing that Dallas police officer, J.D. Tippit. But there was 4 shells at the scene, 2 different types. That's one problem. Like Oswald's going to have 2 different guns and shoot two rounds from each. And witnesses saw 2 men, not 1. And in addition to that, Dallas police officer J.D. Poe, Poe was his last name. I don't remember his first name or initials. He inscribed his initials on those casings. They're not the ones in evidence. Okay, so that's a problem, and it shows deception, and this does too. This shows, that something came up that disproved what they're saying. I just gave you like 3 different things that would show that this is quite impossible. Their whole scenario has several problems, not just one that you could try to explain away. There's several problems, and there's nothing pointing to it being a real mechanism. In addition to that, even if you gave them the south wall buckling, even if you gave them that, and this is another point in here, that it's point 19. The column stress due to load redistribution is not sufficient to cause failure. Even if the south wall buckled, south exterior wall of the north tower buckled, the loads, and the report shows this, the exterior columns only had 20% of their capacity being used. Those columns, because they had to take wind and seismic loads too. So there was very little wind that day. There was no earthquakes. So they only had gravity. And gravity only used 20% of the load on the exterior columns. You use a third, about 33% on the core columns. So if that south wall went, there would be load redistribution through the hat truss to the core to some degree, and through the spandrels to the exterior walls on the east and west sides. They don't have enough load to cause failure of those other walls. So we had a horizontal propagation at the 98th floor that occurs in less than a second. The southwest corner and the northeast corner fail within a second or less of each other. The thing starts coming down at the 98th floor. That's 300 feet almost. So for some kind of failure of the south wall to propagate that quickly is incredible. It's just not going to happen. And they don't have the loads to do it. And they don't even show that, because they say they stopped their analysis at the point where the tower is poised to collapse. They don't prove that because their loads that are from the failure are not enough to cause the other parts to fail. So they're just making a claim without any basis.
It's good for our audience to listen to this, and you talked about the Kennedy assassination and that officer writing his initials on the bullets, because when you study this thing, and people say, yeah, Kennedy will never be acknowledged, blah, 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 or that people who lived then will all be dead by the time it is, whatever, when you study these things and you find out what worked and what was good at exposing stuff, it teaches you how to do investigations for the next big thing that takes place, and to do these types of things like writing the initials on the bullet, to get past these cover-ups that take place later. And as we get more knowledge of what went wrong in these investigations and what people who are covering up crimes do, we take a step towards stopping them from covering up a crime later in the future. We make the public more justifiably distrustful of the authorities tasked with covering these events up, and in turn we teach them how to surpass these cover-ups, how to basically stop the cover-up from taking place in the future. So, as you know, we're getting more practice, but we're also going to expose this too, because this is something that happened in front of everybody, and Building 7, I think, was a step too far. There's scientific evidence that we talk about all the time, but there's also, when I say two eyes and common sense, I'm talking about your instinctive evidence, when you can look at something and just know it's not right. And I think most people get that just when they watch Building 7 coming down.
Right, yeah, you don't have to be an engineer to see that there's something wrong here. That's exactly right. Your common sense and life experience of the average person, they realize things that's built that well don't just fall apart because of a little problem here or there in the item or building. In this case, it's a symmetric free fall. This is a 300-foot long building. It's 144-foot wide. It doesn't come down symmetrically at free fall because there's some scattered fires in it. It doesn't work like that.
That's right. Now, for your paper, obviously you said earlier that it's meant for a grand jury, but who are other people, other readers you would like to have reading this, and how can our audience help get the word out, help you out in what you're trying to do to expose the lie?
Well, they can send it to college professors they've had. They can send it to police, firefighters, people in positions that have some level of authority, and make them aware that there's serious deficiencies with the NIST reports on the World Trade Center building collapses. Serious deficiencies.
Now, before we close out the interview, is there any final words you want to leave our audience with, inspiration or inquiry, anything that you want to stick in their heads?
Well, I would say look, this is a long, drawn-out affair. I understand that it's wearing. People don't have to do this and live it and breathe it every day. They have to be aware of it. And when something comes up like this 25 points, these are brought up to simply make a small effort to pass it on, and to make everybody else aware. Because ultimately, it is a united we stand, divided we fall issue. If criminals that have infiltrated our government and effected a cover-up, committed a massive crime and effected a cover-up, if they're united but the public is not, they win. And that's what seems to have happened in other big events. And, you can't let that happen. You can't get down, you can't think you're going to solve it overnight. But whatever little thing you can do, you should do. Like Mahatma Gandhi said, something along the lines that no matter what it is that you do, no matter how small it is, you should do it. You shouldn't feel like you have to do it all yourself. Just do a small thing. One thing here would be to pass this on to people they know. A lot of people know college professors and firemen and police and other officials. Pass it around.
Right, and I heard it in an old piece of World War II propaganda, but I think it applies to our cause too, is that a million small things done well every day is going to be what wins this war for us. Tony Szamboti, I want to thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall. Folks, the paper is Areas of Specific Concern in the NIST World Trade Center reports. We're going to have it linked up in the episode description here of this episode for everybody to download and print out and pass out however you can. Thank you so much, Tony.
Okay, Andy. Song now.
This program is on No Lies Radio every Thursday night at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download MP3s of this show from the Internet Archive by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week. Good luck.
The 9/11 Commission, which was tasked with giving us the fullest explanation. No, not one sentence in the 571 pages of the 9/11 Commission report even mentions the destruction of World Trade Center 7. Is this one of the reasons, perhaps, that Senator Max Cleland resigns from the commission, citing it's a national scandal? The investigation is compromised. How about expert corroboration? How about Danny Jawenko, 27-year controlled demolitions expert? It starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. It's professional work, without a doubt. How about Hugo Bachmann, Professor Emeritus, Chairman, Department of Structural Dynamics at Earthquake Engineering, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology? In my opinion, the building, World Trade Center 7, was with great probability professionally demolished. Here's a floor plan of Building 7. Now, to bring a building smoothly, symmetrically into its own footprint without falling over, what we have to do is remove the core columns, because what we want to do is bring the outside of the building in on itself. Now, this involves a high degree of precision that fire is not capable of, being an organic process.